Let's take a look at what happens if in Silverlight you try to call over HTTP from one website to another website. So let me explain what I've got here. I've got one instance of Visual Studio which is looking at my local web server. So this is IIS and it's a localhost secure service. I've built a WCF service in there. It has an interface called iSpies. We have a method called getSpies. It returns a list of strings. If we look at the implementation of this, all it does is return a hard-coded list of strings. That's it. I've configured this to work with the HTTP binding, so if we go and look at this, here is the basic HTTP binding which works with Silverlight. We know this from our previous video about calling web services, and that's all I've got really in this website over here. I've got another copy of Visual Studio here where I've got a traditional standard Silverlight application. So I've got the Silverlight application here and the website that hosts that Silverlight application here. And we notice that this is going to run up at HTTP localhost port 51029 on a virtual path of HTTPS services web. So when this Silverlight application runs up, it is running on the Cassini web server on port 51029. What I've done is added a service reference to the web service I just showed you, which is at port 80 on my machine. It's running in IIS on the default port. And I've built a little piece of UI, and all the UI does is it has a button called getSpies and a list box. And if we look at the code behind the UI, we've added a service reference. We just used add service reference to add a service reference to that web service I just showed you, which is running on port 80. And we create the proxy, and we call across the proxy, and then we set the data context with the result. So all we're really doing is running on one website and making a web service request to another website. So let's go and run this Silverlight application on port, I think it was 51029, there we go. And when we click this button, we're going to call across to localhost, which is port 80. And what should happen is, well, nothing. Here we go. We get an error saying not found. Let's continue and continue and continue, and we get lots of breakpoints on the exceptions. Now I've actually got the Fiddler tool running in the background here, and if we go and look at this Fiddler tool, let's just get rid of most of the requests in here apart from these two at the bottom. We'll see that we just made two requests. We made a request for a file called client-access-policy.xml and another one called cross-domain.xml in that order. So we were just trying to make these two requests. So essentially what this is about is in Silverlight, if you call from your application to some other site, where some other site would include obviously a change of domain name, but also a change of port, what we're doing here, what Silverlight will do is it won't just call across domains by default. It will only call across domains if the domain that you are going to serves up one of these two files, like client-access-policy.xml or cross-domain.xml. So let's go and have a look at these two files. Let me shut this down for a second and we'll go back to Visual Studio. Okay, let me just move over to the root of my web server. For me it lives in D inetpub www root, and in here you'll see that I've got a file called client-access-policy.hidden. So I'm hiding this at the moment. Let's rename client-access-policy.hidden to client-access-policy.xml. And let's just take a look at it in Notepad, client-access-policy.xml. So if we have a look at this, you'll see what this is saying is we have an access policy. We're going to allow from any domain, which is what I'm allowing on my website, to this path of slash and including subpaths. So there's a full schema for this in the Silverlight documentation, but basically what I'm saying is that my access policy is to allow calls from pretty much anywhere and to pretty much anything. So I now have that file in place. If we go back to our Silverlight project, let's just go back and do that. Let's stop debugging this. Let's press F5. Let's get the UI. Let's click on the button. You see that we now get results, and if we go back to Fiddler, we'll be able to see in Fiddler once again that if I clear out some other traffic in here, that we did make a request for client access policy, and furthermore we got that file back from the web server. So because that file is in place, we're allowed to make this cross-domain call. It's very important to realize that Silverlight will be asking for that file at the very root of your website. So if your service is nested down in some virtual path, Silverlight will still go back to hostname / client-access-policy.xml. It's very important to realize that. That's exactly where Silverlight's going to go for that file. Let's go back to our root of our web server again, and let's rename client-access-policy.xml to client-access-policy.hidden again. So now if we go back to our scenario, let's refresh the application. It should fail. It's probably cached that file. So let's just do something sneaky in here and clear out any temporary internet files. Let's close that down just to make sure this is doing what we think it's doing. Okay, so let's try that again. And we can see we're back to failing again because we no longer have a client access policy. Let's stop debugging on that. Let's go back to our website, because I also have a file in here called crossdomain.hidden. So let's rename crossdomain.hidden to crossdomain.xml. Let's take a look at this file. Just bring up Notepad on that file, crossdomain.xml. Now this file is a format that's controlled by Adobe. So the existing Adobe Flash player encounters the same scenario as Silverlight in that it wants to make cross-domain requests, and there is already this file format out there which deals with this for the Flash player, and Silverlight is compatible with that. So if you've got any site that's already cross-domain callable from Flash, it will also be cross-domain callable from Silverlight. So again, we have a cross-domain policy in here. It says which domains we can access from. It says which domains we're prepared to accept headers from and what headers they might be. And with that in place, we can go back to our site. So if we just switch back to the right Visual Studio, let's press F5 in here again. And if we click on our button to get our data, we get data back into the UI. And if we go and take a look at the Fiddler proxy, if we just clear some of these things out, we can see that we just called out for client access policy first. That doesn't exist. So we tried for crossdomain.xml and we got crossdomain.xml back. We can see there is the XML. And so we could go ahead and call that service, which is resident on another server. So hopefully you get the idea that calling from one Silverlight application on one website to something like a web service on another website, and this also occurs if you're doing things like socket access, which we'll talk about in different videos. If you're making those cross-domain requests, then you need to have one of these access policy files in place, whether it be the Flash access policy or the Silverlight client access policy. And you can see from Fiddler there that obviously Silverlight prefers its own policy file before it goes ahead and makes a request for the Flash policy file.